Two of the most powerful AI models on Earth just went head-to-head. And here's the part nobody saw coming. You probably can't legally use either one of them yet. This is the showdown, where the US government is the real third contestant. On the 26th of June, 2026, OpenAI announced the GPT-5.6 family, and the top tier is a model called Sol, built for the hardest problems, complex coding, and security research. In the other corner sits Claude Fable 5 from Anthropic, and Fable 5 has a strange backstory we'll get to, because, reportedly, it's the Claude model the US government pulled offline. So let's actually run this race. Benchmarks, price, modes, efficiency, a fair fight, not a fanboy take. And then, the twist that reframes the whole thing. Let's start where the marketing slides start. The benchmarks. OpenAI's self-reported terminal bench. 2.1 results put GPT 5.6 Sol at 88.8%. Claude Mythos 5, Anthropic's heavyweight, lands at 88.0, and Claude Fable 5 sits at 84.3. So on OpenAI's own scoreboard, Sol narrowly tops both Claude models on the headline number. T here is also a souped-up configuration, Sol Ultra, which OpenAI clocks at 91.9%. Sounds decisive, right? Slow down. Every one of those figures is OpenAI's self-reported terminal, Bench 2.1. Vendor reported, with independent verification still pending. When the company that built the model also runs the test and picks the test, you treat the win as a claim, not a fact. And the margins matter here. 88.8 versus 88.0 is less than a single percentage point. That's not a blowout. That's a photo finish, and a photo finish on a track the home team built and timed. Note, too, that GPT 5.6 Terra, the business tier model, ties Claude Fable 5 at exactly 84.3. So Fable 5 isn't being humiliated here. It's losing to OpenAI's flagship by a few points, on OpenAI's home turf, and matching OpenAI's own mid-tier model, step for step. Now flip the board over. On several independent public benchmarks measured before Sol even existed, Exultarts and Erie, Claude Fable 5 has led US to Ars Talking, SWE-Bench Pro at 80.3%, LiveCodeBench at 89.78%, and Humanity's Last Exam at 59.0%. These aren't OpenAI's numbers, they were from third-party coverage, the kind of testing OpenAI doesn't control. So here is the honest scoreboard so far. Sol edges Fable 5 on OpenAI's own terminal bench, but Fable 5 still leads multiple independent coding benchmarks. The winner literally depends on which benchmark you trust. Anyone who tells you one model won cleanly is selling you something. And there's a deeper point hiding in here. A single benchmark is a snapshot of one kind of task. Terminal Bench measures agentic terminal work. SWE-Bench Pro measures real-world software engineering tickets. LiveCodeBench measures fresh coding problems. A model can dominate one and trail on another, which is exactly the pattern we're seeing, so which is better is the wrong question. Better at what? And according to whose lab, is the right one? So let's talk money, because that's where it gets interesting. Claude Fable 5 is the premium pick, $10 per million input tokens, $50 per million output. GPT 5.6 Sol undercuts it hard at $5 in, $30 out. That's half the input price, and a meaningful discount on output for the top-tier OpenAI model. And it's not just Sol playing the price card. The mid-tier model, Terra, runs $250 in and $15 out, which OpenAI says is exactly half the price of the previous GPT 5.5 for comparable work. Sit with that for a second. The same company just cut its own business tier price in half, generation over generation. The everyday model, Luna, drops to $1 in and $6 out, aimed at summarization, drafting, and routine automation, the high-volume, low-stakes work where price per token actually dominates your bill. Deer is also a reportedly enormous 1.5 million token context window on the family. So on raw price per token, OpenAI is aggressively cheaper across the entire lineup. If your only question is what costs less per token for frontier coding, Sol wins that line item, and it isn't close. But token efficiency is a different question from token price. And this is where the comparison gets genuinely nerdy and genuinely important. OpenAI claims that on GeneBench v1, a biology benchmark, Sol beats the older GPT-5.5 while using fewer tokens. And on ExploitBench, a cybersecurity benchmark, they say Sol is competitive with Claude Mythos while using roughly a third of the output tokens. Think about what that means for your bill. Output tokens are the expensive ones. That's the $50 number, the $30 number. If Sol gets to a comparable answer using a third of the output, then the real-world cost gap versus Claude can be much wider than the sticker price alone suggests. Picture a task where one model writes 1,000 tokens of answer, and Sol writes 300 for the same result. You're not just paying a lower rate, you're buying fewer units at that lower rate. The two effects stack, again, vendor reported, so independent verification is pending, but if it holds up, efficiency is Sol's sharpest weapon. Sharper than the headline benchmark by a hair. The benchmark says slightly better answers. The efficiency claim says similar answers, dramatically cheaper. And for anyone running these at scale, that second story is the one that actually moves budgets. Then there are the new modes, and these are Sol only. The first is max reasoning effort, which simply gives Sol more time to reason deeply before it answers, slower, but more thorough. Think of it as letting the model show its work, instead of blurting out the first thing. The second is the one everyone's going to talk about, Ultra mode. Instead of one single agent grinding through a complex multi-step problem, Ultra mode coordinates multiple sub-agents working in parallel. That's the configuration that hit 91.9 on Terminal Bench. It is a real architectural shift, less one genius in a room, more a team that divides the work, with different sub-agents tackling different pieces of a multi-step job at the same time. That's a meaningfully different way to attack a hard problem, and it's why Ultra posts the highest number in the whole lineup. Whether that translates to your actual messy codebase, nobody outside the preview can independently say yet, and that word preview is where this whole story turns. Here is the twist. GPT 5.6 is not generally available. It launched as a limited preview to only about 20 organizations, and the reason is the headline. According to OpenAI and multiple major outlets, VentureBeat, CNN, Engadget, Axios, the Decoder, OpenAI shared the models and its release plans with the US government before any broad release. The Office of the National Cyber Director and the Office of Science and Technology Policy pushed for a phased rollout. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick called OpenAI directly to warn against proceeding without broader agency sign-off. And during this preview, the US government approves access on a customer-by-customer basis. Read that again. A federal government is deciding, customer by customer, who gets to use a commercial AI product. That is not how software has shipped for the last 20 years. You don't apply to the government for a database license or a spreadsheet seat. This is a new posture, and it's aimed squarely at the frontier. Sam Altman addressed it directly, and I'll quote him verbatim. We've made clear to the US government that this is not our preferred long-term model, and will work with them and others in industry to achieve a more sustainable approach for future releases. Then OpenAI says a broader release is hoped for the coming weeks. And to be precise about language, this is not a ban. Sol is restricted, gated to government-approved customers, shipping with what OpenAI calls its most robust safety stack to date, with strengthened protections for higher-risk activity, sensitive cyber requests, and repeated misuse. So the framing matters. Nobody outlawed Sol. OpenAI chose a phased release under government pressure, and the government is signing off on who gets in, restricted and gated, not banned. Now, here is why Fable 5 is the perfect opponent for this fight. This didn't come out of nowhere. Reportedly, per the Decoder, Anthropic presented a model called Mythos back in April 2026, and the US government then forced Anthropic to pull Claude Fable 5 offline. That move established the regulatory precedent that shaped these GPT 5.6 restrictions. So when we say Sol versus Fable 5, we're not just comparing two spec sheets. We were comparing the model the government is gating today against the model the government already pulled. Both frontier flagships, both in different ways, access restricted. The state has its hand on both contestants, and the Sol rollout looks a lot like OpenAI trying to avoid Fable 5's fate by getting ahead of the regulators instead of getting pulled by them. So who actually wins? Let me give you the honest verdict, because it isn't a clean one. On OpenAI's self-reported terminal, SWE-Bench 2.1, Sol edges out Fable 5, and even Claude Mythos 5 on price per token and on token efficiency. Sol looks like the stronger deal, sometimes dramatically, if those efficiency claims survive independent testing. But on several independent public benchmarks, Fable 5 still leads on coding, and the decisive factor isn't a benchmark at all, it's access. Most people literally cannot use Sol right now. About 20 organizations can. So the real winner depends on the benchmark you trust and on who's even allowed through the door. And that's the uncomfortable thing I want you to sit with. We came here to argue about percentages, 88.8 versus 84.3, $5 versus 10. But the actual story of June 2026 isn't which model is 2 points better at a coding test. It's that the two most capable AI models in the world are now both behind a government gate, with a commerce secretary making phone calls and access granted one customer at a time. The benchmark war is almost a distraction. The real shift is that best model available now has an asterisk that reads available to whom. The spec sheet stopped being the most important page. The access list did. So watch the next few weeks, because they decide which way this goes. If OpenAI's broader release actually lands on the timeline they're hoping for, the price and efficiency story makes Sol very hard to ignore, and the gating becomes a footnote. If that broader release slips or the gating tightens instead, then Fable 5's fate stops looking like an exception and starts looking like the rule, the new normal for frontier models. Either way, the question to ask about any frontier model from now on isn't just how good is it, it's who decided you're allowed to use it. And keep your eye on the attribution. When these benchmark numbers get rerun by independent labs, that's the moment we find out whether Sol's lead is real. Or just well marketed. Stay curious. This is AI Unpacked.